Quarterly, Lamentations, Song of Songs, Ecclesiastes. Lesson 10, Ecclesiastes 3, Time and Eternity. The preacher continues his exploration of topics that make living in this fallen world frustrating and confusing, here focusing in on the topics of time and eternity. Human beings are created with a sense of eternity written on their hearts, Ecclesiastes 3:11. Yet at the same time, events occur according to God's timetable and not our own. That timetable is inscrutable and sometimes incomprehensible, and God does not deign to explain himself to us. In a world where we often experience injustice, our hearts cry out for God to set things right in an eternal tribunal, verses 16 and 17. And yet humans appear to end up just like animals, dead and buried, with nothing beyond the grave. Again, the preacher does not spoon-feed us the answer to these questions. He leaves us to ponder how best to resolve them. There is a time for everything under heaven, says the preacher. There's a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot, and so on, in verses 1 through 8. Each of these pairs seems to list something positive together with something negative, although for a few of the items there's not necessarily agreement among commentators as to which is which. There are good things in life, and there are bad things in life, and each has their season. Beyond that, however, there is no discernible order. There's no progression from beginning to end, no one thing towards which the list progresses. Scholars have suggested all kinds of organizing principles to try to make a coherent structure, though these all end up feeling forced. Meanwhile, in the 1960s, the pop group The Byrds turned the passage into a song which encapsulated a plea for peace in our time, through the addition of a final line after "a time for peace," saying, "I swear it's not too late." But the biblical poem has no such neat resolution. In reality, the list defies all the efforts to find a neat literary structure, which I would argue is exactly what we should expect from the preacher. Life is not neat and tidy. It resists categorization. Good things follow bad things, and bad things follow good things in our lives, with little apparent rhyme or reason. There's a measure of truth in the thought that life is, as the novelist Joseph Haller once put it, a trash bag of random coincidences torn open in the wind. At least, it feels that way. You can be on the pinnacle of personal or professional success today and in the pits of disaster tomorrow. You can be promoted to the job of your dreams, only to have the company bought out and you be laid off. You can marry your high school sweetheart and then watch helplessly as she is swept away by a tsunami on your honeymoon. That's the way life is, no matter how organized or disorganized you are. Life is complex, and it's not ours to control. The result of that reality is that it can feel as if all our hard work goes for nothing. What does the worker gain from his toil? Verse 9. If everything you care can be swept away in an instant. God has placed this as a burden on Adam's offspring. See chapter 1, verse 13. God is the one who makes everything fitting in its appropriate time, verse 11. The good, the bad, and the ugly, everything outlined in verses 1 through 8. Many English translations sanitize the idea, translating it, "He has made everything beautiful in its time." But many of the events in verses 1 through 8 are not beautiful. Death, killing, and war will never be beautiful. But without Adam and Eve's sin, their offspring would not have had to endure them. Now, however, they are among the events that God has ordained that fit into His plan, even if not into ours. God brings everything to pass precisely at its time, as the New Jewish Publication Society renders it. This incomprehensible world might make us conclude that life is indeed meaningless. There is no grand plan. Yet something deep within us resists that conclusion. The preacher calls it having eternity written on your heart, verse 11. We were made to try to discern patterns in what we see around us. Yet at the same time, we live in a universe that's so complex that we cannot hope to comprehend it all. No one can comprehend God's work from beginning to end, verse 11. And one valid response is to be thankful for the good times in life, which are equally out of our control. Life, healing, and shalom, wholeness, or as the ESV renders it, peace, these too are not random. They come to us from a good God as gifts to us, verse 13. Simple pleasures like eating, drinking, and success in our work are to be celebrated, even if they too do not fall into a comprehensible pattern. What we do is temporary, here and then gone. But what God does endures forever, verse 14. No one can add to it or take away from it. God is entirely sovereign over this world, which means that our successes and failures, our joys and our sorrows are all part of His greater plan. Human workers achieve nothing with their toil, verse 9. Yet God's work accomplishes all His holy purposes, specifically in order that people should fear Him, verse 14. Here the preacher sounds the same note as Proverbs 1:7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, which suggests that those commentators who see Ecclesiastes as proclaiming a contrary message of Proverbs have not understood it properly. Yet as creatures with eternity written on our hearts, verse 11, merely to eat, drink, and be merry without reference to our purpose as human beings and the future that awaits us cannot be enough to satisfy us. If God is sovereign over all events that happen in this universe, and if no one can add or subtract anything to His purposes, verse 14, why is there so much injustice in this world? In addition to the individual personal injustices that we may suffer, there's systemic injustice. Injustice enthroned in the very structures that are supposed to deliver justice, verse 16. Bribery and corruption in the judiciary was endemic in those days, and continues to vex humanity down to the present. Our hearts cry out for God to judge the wicked and to deliver us from evil, verses 16 to 17. But we all recognize that in this life it doesn't always happen that way. Not everyone gets what is coming to them in life, and good and bad alike all die in the end. So doesn't that ultimate fact of death seem to make everything in this short and frustrating life meaningless? Even simple pleasures like eating and drinking. At the end of all things, what is it that distinguishes man from the animals? Both seem to have the same breath, both die, and their bodies return to dust in exactly the same way, verse 18. There doesn't seem to be much distinction between them, if we take the preacher's statement at face value. Yet the preacher is pressing us to wrestle with the hard questions of life once again. In our hearts, the ones with eternity written on them, none of us really believes that we're no different from the animals. If there's no difference between humans and animals, why don't we find animals asking the same questions that we ask? When did a sheep or a cow ever wonder what the meaning of his life is? Does a dog question the justice of the universe when you hide his favorite toy because you just can't stand him squeaking it one more time? We're like the animals, but we're also not like them. We long for justice and righteousness, and we sorrow over injustice and evil in a way that never even crosses their minds. So how do we resolve the tension between living in a world that is far beyond our comprehension and our control, while at the same time being created with an innate desire for justice and meaning? Once again, the preacher poses the question, but doesn't simply hand us the answer. Neither a trite optimism that thinks, well, if I just do the right thing, life will work out well, nor a nihilistic pessimism that imagines we're mere animals in a meaningless universe fits reality. We live in a messy and broken world, disordered by human sin, but nonetheless made and overruled by a good God to accomplish His holy purposes. However incomprehensible those purposes are to us. So we should enjoy the momentary gifts and passing pleasures that he gives us, verse 13, while fearing and obeying him as our all-wise creator, verse 14, and acknowledging our limitations and our weakness. In the light of the rest of the scriptures, we know that we're not mere animals, for whom death is the end. We're eternal souls, designed to live with God forever. Application questions. 1. Think about a time in your life when something very unexpected happened. Was it a good surprise or a painful one? How did you process that reality? How do you know that life is not simply a trash bag of coincidences torn open in the wind? 3. Why is the fear of the Lord critical to skillful living in this world? 4. How does the coming of Jesus answer at least some of the questions that are posed in Ecclesiastes 3?